For those of you who don't know me, I'm Maggie Detloff, the Cantor's Assistant Curator of Photo and New Media. So it's really a pleasure for me to welcome you to tonight's event with Sofía Gallisá Muriente, whose film I hope you had a chance to go see in our Russell Gallery, but if not, it is up through May 19th, so you have lots of time. Before I introduce the event, I would like to acknowledge we're on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Muwekma Ohlone people and play Stanford's Land Acknowledgement.
Stanford sits on the ancestral lands of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe.
This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people.
Consistent with our values of community and inclusion,
We have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible
the university's relationship to Native peoples.
Thank you for your attention to that. And now I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's event. Muriente is a Puerto Rican artist whose research-based practices aim to resist colonial erasures and reclaim historical agency, proposing new or renewed mechanisms for remembering and reimagining. Her work contests the dominant visual narratives through multiple and subjective approaches, employing and exploring the poetic and political implications of text, image, and archive, which you see as both subject and medium in her work. Tonight's event is presented in conjunction with our current installation of the 41-minute video Celaje, on view through May 19th, as I already said. The artist refers to this work as an elegy for losses both personal and collective arising within the confluence of Puerto Rico's colonial histories and recent natural disasters such as Hurricane Maria in 2017 and the COVID-19 pandemic. The work's evocative sound collage serves as an analogy for the sedimentation of these economic, political, and environmental disasters, while a combination of footage exposed to the elements, hand-developed and scratched film, footage of the artist's late grandmother, and scenes filmed in post-Hurricane Maria and COVID-19 era Puerto Rico reflects on impermanence and uncertainty. The artwork title Celaje is translated as Cloudscape, but it was interesting for me to hear in one of our early sort of Zoom discussions about showing the work that in the Caribbean this word is also used to refer to a fleeting presence, like a person or an animal that goes by in a blur. And so like the film itself, the title poetically conjoins human beings and the rest of the natural world in a sort of shared and inherent impermanence, whether that impermanence comes to pass over days, weeks, years, or millennia even. From 2014 to 2020, Muriente co-directed the artist-run organization Beta Loca in San Juan. She's been a fellow of the Cisneros Institute at MoMA, Smithsonian Institute, and many others, and a resident artist at the Vieques Historical Archive, Alice Yard, and many, many others. Recently, her work has been shown at Documenta 15, at MoMA in New York, at the Whitney Museum of American Art, Museo de Arte Contemporáneo de Puerto Rico, and numerous galleries. It's also currently on view at the Contemporary Arts Center Dazibao in Montreal. So if you make it up to our northern neighbors, go check that out. And excitingly, in 2023, she was awarded the Latinx Artist Fellowship and published the artist book Observatorio de Lagunas, Notas de Campo, with editorial Educación Emergente. Please pardon my Spanish pronunciation, it's very terrible. But I'm thrilled we have Muriente here with us this evening to discuss that ongoing body of work, Observatorio de Lagunas, which is described on our website as a series of explorations of spaces that have been filled or emptied of history, through which she generates connections between the two meanings of the word laguna in Spanish, which can refer to the coastal and dynamic lagoon systems that fluctuate with the tide, but it can also refer to lacunas, or gaps or absences in texts, histories, and memories. So we're in for a real treat to see some of this ongoing work. There will be time for a Q&A at the end of the event, and so please now join me in welcoming Sofía. Before I relinquish the microphone, I wanted to ask you a sort of getting started question. Okay. So as some of y'all may have seen in the film that's on view, you're mixing footage from different kinds of cameras, and I know that's been important in your practice. So can you tell us about your very first camera?
Sure. I think my first camera was a toy camera. It was one of those that has like a ring of slides inside, but I imagined that it was a real camera, and so my mom always tells this story that we were at a restaurant and I put a napkin over my head and started taking fake portraits of people walking by. So I think that's like the earliest memory of having a camera that I have. But I also remember one of those like horizontal film cameras that I dropped in like a mangrove forest as a little girl. So I don't know. It must have been, maybe that was my first functional one. But anyways, thank you all so much for being here tonight. And thank you, Maggie, so much for all your engagement with my work and for your kind introduction. It's very nice to be here. And it's really nice for me to be able to also, first of all, to see the presentation of Celaje that is in the museum right now, which is really beautiful and special to see it in person in such a lovely space. But also to be able to share with you tonight some of my ongoing work and to think about the ways in which it's connected to Celaje, because, you know, obviously there is a sense of continuity that I feel within all of this work, you know, and it's not work that is compartmentalized for me, but at the same time, it's a rare treat to be able to kind of think about it with others and speak about it and to be able to show some clips. And so, yeah, so it's always a nice thing to be able to use an opportunity to speak about the work to also keep understanding it or processing it myself. Anyways, oh, this is my first camera. I didn't realize it was in the slideshow. But yeah, that's my toy camera. So I'll start with some stills from Celaje, and particularly some stills of film that has been corroded or that has visible traces of time and decay, because that in many ways was kind of the departure point for Assimilate and Destroy, which is a series of works that I made after Hurricane Maria, of which Celaje is a part of, and perhaps the final part. Assimilate and Destroy came to be because in the aftermath of the storm, in this moment of, you know, exacerbation of all the conditions of the tropics, one thing that was really present for me that I had been paying attention to before, but that was suddenly like overwhelmingly present, was all of these invisible forces that are kind of eating away at the material evidence of everything in the tropics, right? And just the way in which climate seems to condition memory in the tropics by determining the survival of everything, you know, of structures, of materials, of people, of plants, of things, of structures. And I wanted to make these invisible forces visible somehow. And so I started experimenting with different ways in which I could deteriorate or accelerate the process of deterioration of film, whether it was by burying color film, like in this case, and allowing it to grow mold and for the mold to eat away at the emulsion and to create new images on the film, or whether it was to expose black and white film to salt. And then later I also started working with film that had just been deteriorating in my freezer after the power went out, or that was expired and that had different traces, visible traces of time. I also started experimenting with hand developing because I was interested in the trace of labor, in the trace of process, and how to make that visible as well, and how, in many ways, you know, I wanted to create images that were beyond my control, where I recognized the limits of my control over the construction of the image, and I think that was something that really drew me to analog film after Maria. This desire to kind of surrender to the elements in a way, and that's something that analog film really allows for, in terms of knowing that, you know, whether it's light, whether it's the equipment that you're using, or the process of developing that film, there's all sorts of moments where there's variables that you control and variables that you don't. And so this, for example, is just a frame from Celaje of hand-developed film that, because I was running out of a particular chemical and I shook it more heavily than other rolls, suddenly it had a lot more scratches and marks and visual artifacts on it, just kind of tracing the process of me developing it. And so that exploration of film, but also that exploration of kind of, let's say, an environmental knowledge, or a recognition of language from nature that could allow me to name things differently, is something that definitely comes from the process of Celaje, where I got close to not just mycology, but also geology and other fields of science. And the term assimilate and destroy, or the title assimilate and destroy, actually comes from when reading about salt corrosion of film. One thing that I read that I really kind of felt like I had to sit with for a while was the fact that when salt is developing crystals on the film and eating away at the film, it both destroys the larger molecules to make them smaller molecules and assimilates them at the same time. And this notion that destruction and assimilation could somehow be parallel processes that fed off each other was something that, in that moment of profound collapse and destruction, felt like an idea that I really wanted to hold on to and explore in different ways. And so that's a lot of what this series of works do, and that kind of culminates with Celaje, but I was definitely kind of changed after that, in the sense that I was starting to learn to look at nature differently, or read the environment around me differently and more deeply. And I was really interested in continuing this exploration of how, through a closer understanding of nature, I could also find other language with which to speak about history and memory and Puerto Rico, and sometimes conversations that might seem somehow exhausted, you know, and how to breathe new life into some of these conversations. And so Observatorio de Lagunas is, or Laguna Observatory, which is how I've translated it, is really a series of explorations around memory and memory work in Puerto Rico. But it departs from, again, an exploration of lagoons and just a desire to share space with many different kinds of people that I want to learn from and spend time with. And I don't know, for me, my work is very rooted in research, but that research is often just hanging out with smart people that I want to learn from, or going on walks, or sharing space, you know, thinking about things together, asking a friend to do sound for me so that I can go and film something that I'm interested in. This, for example, is a walk that I did with two artist friends and this biologist to Laguna Grande in Fajardo, as I began to learn about lagoons. And it was an amazing experience, because like 3 hours into it, we were talking about chaos theory, and and this man was kind of blowing my mind in reconsidering the ways in which I thought about the future, just based on how he understood the future at the lagoon. So, you know, I think that often it's a way of rarifying somehow the quest for something that might seem obvious. In this case, this tension around memory and the tension between like an official colonized history of Puerto Rico and counter narratives to that. This is from a walk with artist Elizabeth Robles, who is another person that I enjoy very much spending time with and thinking with. She took me to a particular lagoon where she likes to go and draw. And she was the one who initiated this photograph. She wanted for us to have a portrait together with her feet deep into the mud of the mangrove. And this is from a walk with Anaira Santori, who's a philosopher and professor who I've developed a very close friendship with the last few years. And one of the things that has been at the center of our friendship has been walking to this lagoon that is near her house in the southwestern part of Puerto Rico, which is actually one of the most ancient geological parts, you know, geologically speaking, one of the most ancient sites in Puerto Rico. It has a very particular geological history, and just became a place that we walked to repeatedly during the lockdown and throughout the pandemic. And the process of walking there, the conversations that happen there, have a lot to do with the work that I've been doing, and also it has just been a place from which to imagine and think about a lot of the reflections that I'm interested in through this project. And so I recently finished this piece, which is actually images shot in Super 8 in Laguna Guaniquilla in Cabo Rojo. And in this case, they're hand-developed with water from the mountains of Puerto Rico from a friend's farm, which we didn't realize was very high in minerals and had a crazy, unexpected effect on the color of the film. So this is part of the result of that. To me, that room for accident and randomness in the hand developing is what is fascinating in terms of how it creates an image beyond my control or my idea of what I want, even. And in this case, you know, there's a combination of the accident of the water that we used, also a process of attempt at coloring the film. But all of it just kind of brings out this poetry that I think is inherent in that space, which is this space as a sort of mystic kind of ancestral place, and also of having some sort of possibility of opening windows to other places. And I think that it's beautiful the way that it comes, you know, kind of oscillates between a readable image, let's say, and like much more abstracted sensorial images. This next image is from Laguna Anones in Vieques. This is a lagoon that was for over 60 years in what used to be a U.S. Navy base in the island of Vieques, which is part of the Puerto Rican archipelago off the eastern coast of the main island. And Vieques is a really complex, contested territory. 2/3 of it were occupied by the U.S. Navy. It was a very, an enormous process of civil disobedience that resulted in the closing of that base. But the grounds, many of them continue to be polluted and inaccessible. And the land is controlled still by Fish and Wildlife, so by the federal government. And I was able to access this lagoon with fishermen who used to be active in the civil disobedience and used to camp near this place while the civil disobedience was happening. And this lagoon is still, as you can see, full of military pollution and trash, exploded missiles and other sorts of remnants of the activities that happened there. And I was interested in visiting this place, but I was also really struck by the fact that other lagoons in Vieques that might be even more polluted in the present don't show it, right? Like that look like beautiful bodies of water and exist in places that are called natural reserves and protected by Fish and Wildlife. And so, you know, I think one of the tensions with my work and perhaps one of the reasons that I've often explored different mediums for altering images is the fact that I find it's often so complicated to doubt what we are seeing, right? To really see beyond, for example, the beauty of a natural landscape and understand what we're actually looking at, let's say. And I think Vieques is a really complicated place in this way because it's also full of really beautiful beaches, right? And that is often the dominant image that we see of this place. And it's hard to balance those really beautiful, striking landscapes with the history of that place. This is my friend Ardel Negron, who lives in Vieques, who was also very active in the struggle to get the Navy out, and is currently a cancer patient, as many, many people are in Vieques. And Ardel one time was telling me stories from the time of the civil disobedience, and she kept losing her train of thought in different ways. Like she kept jumping from one topic to another or not being able to finish sentences. And at some point she interrupted herself and she said, "Sorry, it's the chemo brain." And to me, it was a really revelatory moment that was really clarifying in terms of thinking about how memory is shaped in a place like Vieques and how it's shaped, how memory is shaped in the body, how it's shaped in the land, in the territory, and also how all of these things are intertwined, right? How the history of this place and the pollution doesn't just kind of filter the water and affect the ecosystems there, but also gets in the body of the people there and ends up shaping the way they even remember their lives or their histories. And so, you know, I've spent a lot of time in Vieques working with the Vieques Community Archive, like Maggie was saying in her introduction, but also just thinking about this connection, about, you know, how there's a very concrete effort in this community archive to preserve counter histories and to preserve the memory of the people that have lived in this place, that have been, you know, suffered displacements throughout the years, first because of the Navy base, but more recently because of Airbnb and other things. But at the same time, there's an archive that is very clearly like manifested in the land. It's in the bodies of the people who live there. And so I'm really interested in thinking about those in relationship. And it's a place that I've learned from a lot. And there's actually one of the people that I've met working there, his name is Manolín Silva. He is someone who has been active in land occupations and is also kind of a Vieques historian of sorts, and has also been practicing and teaching how to play steel drums for a very long time, and kind of trying to preserve those bonds that exist between Vieques and other smaller Antilles, because it's the easternmost part of Puerto Rico and the one most connected to kind of the larger Caribbean. And so I told him about the project that I was developing, and I told him about how I wanted to create some sort of ritual with him, or exercise in which we could bring his instrument out to Laguna Kiani, which is the lagoon that I mentioned earlier that is very beautiful and currently part of a natural reserve, but is actually probably the most polluted because it used to be a dumping ground for batteries, and lead sinks to the ground. It doesn't float and wash away like other heavy metals that are present in the bombing residue. And so we visited this lagoon together, and Manolín tried to jam with the sound of the water and the birds in this lagoon, and kind of try to use his instrument to, in some way, harmonize with this space. And so I just wanted to share this with you. This is like very much a work in progress, and unfortunately the sound is not mixed, so it's not very loud, but hopefully if you all can be quiet, you can listen to some very nice steel drums. That was a nice pause. The next part of this project that I wanted to share with you all is a collection of films that I've been helping digitize and catalog at the General Archive in San Juan, which are a collection of films shot by the Intelligence Division of the Puerto Rican Police Department in the 60s and 70s. The Intelligence Division of the Puerto Rican Police Department is a kind of notorious division because in the 90s there was a big legal case that uncovered a lot of their illegal practices and forced them to return the files that they had been keeping on thousands of Puerto Ricans, mostly pro-independence activists. And so the remnants of this collection, the documents that were never claimed, the internal administrative files and surveillance materials that survived from the division, after a long legal process, were declared to be not allowed as legal evidence because they had been kept illegally and were full of lies, but considered historical material that should be preserved and saved in the General Archives. And so they have been there for a long time, but there has never been the proper resources to digitize them or catalog many of them. And so I was very interested particularly in the film collection because, because of the mold and the hurricanes and all of the different disasters that we've been through, there is not that much analog film in our moving image archives, let alone like raw footage, right? Not edited films. And so this was a very intriguing collection that I just wanted to see. And so I kind of volunteered at the archive to help make them seen again and help circulate them. This was working with the archivist in charge of the moving image collection, who is also the union leader and representative of the archivists and currently in a big fight with the archive because of the energy crisis that they've been under for the last couple of months. And I mention all of this because, I, as an artist interested in research, I'm often, trying to allow myself certain liberties beyond the role of the archivist and kind of trying to trust that archives can do their job and I can support them or implicate myself in their work in different ways, but that I should also claim the freedom to do other things. And it's interesting because, I thought that I was doing this work to kind of leave it in the hands of the archive and be able to do my own artwork in response separately. But the archive has been closed to the public for the last few months. Most of their collections have been compromised because of lack of electricity and because some severe storms damaged the electric infrastructure there. And so, so I bring all of that up to say that this work is often like about me wanting to insert myself in different spaces and think from there. And in this case, it was very grounding to spend time in the General Archive, which is our largest, best resourced, institutional formal archive in Puerto Rico, and to kind of confront all of the realities of the day-to-day experience of working there and the labor reality of the archivists, et cetera. And for me, that's all information that comes into the work in different ways. Because at the end of the day, what really drove me to this whole series of inquiries or explorations was a desire to kind of understand what the state of memory is in Puerto Rico today. And I think that is shaped by the labor conditions, the economic conditions, the environmental conditions, all of it. I'm just going to share a piece of my favorite roll of film from the police collection, which is a roll that documents a workshop, a camera workshop for police officers. for me, one of the fascinating aspects about this film collection, as well as the sound collection that is part of the same archive, is the fact that the conditions of the material was able to survive years of neglect and weather and variations and who knows what, in pretty good shape. But then the recordings mostly failed due to really technological inability on the part of the police officers. So there's many films that are out of focus or totally overexposed or shot from a very far away, high angle through a telephoto lens with no tripod. And to see this films from the lens of an image maker has been a really fun exercise also, and like trying to understand how the police understands the camera and understands the medium, and what they were trying to do with images, or how they were understanding image making, but also how they were failing at it. Anyways, I don't have time to go into this project. I don't even know how we're doing on time, but I'm almost at the end, I promise. But but I just wanted to also just mention very quickly as part of the presentation that I've also been developing a project that has to do with the two of the biggest Puerto Rican collections held by the Smithsonian Institute as part of the research fellowship that Maggie mentioned as well. And this is just an image from one of the archives where we've been working, looking at their history of accession and collections from Puerto Rico, and just interrogating a lot of the ways in which that has happened, and where Puerto Rico falls under emerging conversations at Smithsonian about ethical returns. And so, yeah, so that's something that's coming up. But I wanted to just finish up with this piece that I made recently that kind of, in a way, connects different threads from what we've been talking about today. It's a watercolor painted with soils and minerals from Puerto Rico that were made into pigment by artist Carla Claudio. So in a way, it's kind of an archive of soils and minerals, some of them from lagoons. But at the same time, the shape of the piece is the shape of a redacted document from the police intelligence files that I've been working with. And that brings me to this image that, is a kind of a recurring image that I often return to as part of this work, and is thinking around lagoons and lacunas. And it's the fact that in theater and in live TV, in Spanish, there's often a term that's used as bache, which is another kind of way of talking about a lacuna. And a bache just means that through some mistake or interruption, there's been opened up by mistake in the regular programming of what's supposed to happen. And this space needs to be filled. And it is often filled through improvisation in theater or in live TV. When this kind of lacuna emerges, it has to be filled through improvisation. And I think this, there's a risk in using the metaphor of the lacuna or the lagoon. There's a risk in implying that, or creating the suggestion that lagoon is meant to be filled, or that it can be filled, that there's like a wholeness that can be achieved, that there's a reparation of the archive that can be performed in some way. Often people like to talk about rescuing memory even, right? And I think that I'm much more interested in this notion of improvising within the space that lacuna creates, in a way that acknowledges that absence and perhaps proposes other ways of narrating what has happened, or proposes other ways of remembering, but that also recognizes the impossibility of filling in all of the gaps. And that allows us to rehearse other forms of history telling. So thank you so much for being here tonight. And I'll leave you with that. And I think that now we're going to open it up to some questions.
I want to leave plenty of time for audience questions, because if everyone else in the audience is anything like me, they had lots and lots of thoughts as you were presenting. That was just so fantastic. Thank you so much. Really opened up so much of the work for me, even beyond what I had already learned about from you and from reading about your work. So as I said, I have like 2 questions to get us started. One was I wanted to go back to your newer work on the Guanquila Lagoon, Guanquila Luminosa, because I noticed you are doing something similar to what you did in Assimilate and Destroy, which is sort of when you're digitizing that film stock showing multiple frames at a time, which I find really, really effective. And especially watching this new work, it struck me how it's showing time in a different way, where you're sort of seeing the passage of time in sort of an intervalized way. But also some of the footage, like the sort of reticulation of the dry earth, starts to work in sort of a kaleidoscopic way. And so it also works with like movement in a different way. So could you tell us a little more about that decision to digitize that film stock in such a way to show the frames?
Sure. I mean, in the case of other pieces that I had done, because I had either buried the film or put it in salt, it was literally falling apart. So I had to create a little system with a light box and some lenses and magnifying glasses in order to rephotograph the film frame by frame. And so what you see is really an animation of still images. And in this case, and that film, like, I could never scan it properly because it would just kind of fall apart in the scanner. And in this case, the film was actually being scanned, but the way that it was scanned was through stills. And eventually you're supposed to kind of crop it and edit it in a way that you kind of create the illusion that we know as a moving image. But I'm much more interested in this kind of truncated middle process, where also the colors spill over, the movement, as you said, suddenly the dry soil looks almost like it's like you're seeing it through the different frames, and it almost kind of turns into bubbles at some point, I think. It kind of comes in, it like shape shifts in ways that I find really interesting. But yeah, for me, it's a way of also kind of appreciating the film material itself, also beyond just the image that you're creating through the visor, and just like the whole material. Like, I'm not so interested in shooting on film to make it look like video or like the idea that we have of video nowadays, right? I kind of, would rather embrace like all of it. And in this case, it was just like so many beautiful, happy accidents, both in the process of developing it, shooting it, and also, in the scanning of it, that I felt like I was much more interested in that almost as a found film, this film that was just created in the scanning of it.
That's amazing. Thank you. I think it worked really well, all those accidents that came together.
Oh, when I found it, I was very excited. I felt like I was really just kind of finding it between my files.
Amazing. My second question is about archives. And I was thinking about this idea of the lacuna and sort of gaps, and the role of archives that are sort of, they're intended to work against that in a way by preserving history. But historically, we also know that archives have often omitted quite a bit, as you mentioned in your talk. And it was interesting to me in talking about the police footage that becomes an archive in a way, but there was a difference between the police having it sort of as an archive of evidence, and the general archive having it as an archive of history or local memory. And I loved what you brought up about sort of the alternative history, the alternative memory that exists in the landscape and in the bodies of folks that live there. And I love this idea of improvisation as a better goal for a better goal rather than filling in lacuna. This is all mostly a sort of long-winded reflection that's getting me to the question of, can you imagine an alternative form of an institutional archive that could do this improvisational work, or that could sort of address this duality of archives as an institution?
Oh, wow. I mean, my honest answer would be like, I need to keep spending time in different kinds of archives in order to like be able to dream up the archive that I think can do that. Because to me, so far, it's been such a learning experience in like such a reality check, constant, like such a humbling learning experience to spend time in different kinds of archives and implicate myself in the work that is done there, and to really understand what the day-to-day rhythms and modes of those kinds of places are. And to also come at it as someone who is trying to get something from it that is very different, right? Like, who instead of looking for something specific wants to find things, or, you know, accidentally uncover things, or, you know, just like whose strategies are different than many others who are also accessing those spaces. And I think, you know, that's what's interesting. It's also that, for example, with these films, I was really interested in not in having them be like my material that I was going to be making my work with, but in having them be able to be seen and thus circulate and be used by different kinds of people in different kinds of ways. And I think that that's still something that is in the process of happening, but that, you know, I'm much more interested in still learning about what happens when you open up access to certain materials, you know, and but I'm constantly kind of humbled and embarrassed at the reality versus my expectations, you know, because yeah, like I was saying, you put a lot of intention into something that you think you can achieve that supports these things, but to actually see it in action and see what happens is a whole other game. I don't know.
Amazing. And the challenge of protecting things from the elements and the elements getting in the way anyway, those sorts of.
Yeah, that's one of those things where, you know, to some degree, like, it's also really hard to reconcile like your like artistic positionings with like, you know, what you might advise or hope for in an institutional archive. Because I think in my work, I've had to also kind of come to terms with the context and the environment and the conditions as inevitable, and like impermanence as a condition of this place. And it's very hard to try to convince an archivist of like accepting destruction and impermanence as a condition, and to build from there a kind of archive, you know, and to like, how do we just recognize the conditions of this place and build and like really create institutions or spaces that build from there and are not constantly trying to fight against it. And I think before Maria, that was the one thing that really drew me to this idea of climate and memory, was how often you would see just people fighting against the heat and the humidity, you know, this unwinnable fight of, you know, just having air conditionings on at full blast and like dehumidifiers and this and that. And, you know, every time there's a new budget cut, you keep cutting staff, but you can't cut down on the, you know, and energy costs and all of this effort to like contain the conditions of this place, you know? And so, yeah, so to me, it's also about questioning an ideology around conservation that is a lot of, you know, what we've been thinking about in relationship to that Smithsonian project too, because obviously Smithsonian is held as like the standard of care. And so folks in Puerto Rico would say, like, why would you want to return anything back here where we can't necessarily take care of it properly? Leave it there where they can take care of it, you know? But obviously it's a much more complicated conversation.
Absolutely it is, yeah. Thank you.
I can talk about this for a while. Yeah, it can be a long answer, but let's open it up to other people.
We do have a mic that we'll bring around, so if you have a question, please just raise your hand.
Reactions are welcome too.
Well, thanks for inviting reactions, because I'll start there. I'm really struck with this work. As somebody who's an artist myself, I just really like the idea of this sense of impermanence. And I'm curious about your sense of also legacy, because you're using your grandmother's old footage, you're bringing in this other archival bit, you're showing us the history. And I'm curious about what that means to you when you think about also the sense of memory. If there's anything you can say to that.
Yeah, I think to me, I'm really interested in like what survives, in the idea that we can only tell history, especially in places that are precarious in different ways, right? That we can often only tell history through the fragments that survive. And so suddenly your grandma's home movie might become the document that you can tell a certain history, like the only document that you have in order to be able to tell a certain history. And you might be able to, you know, turn the camera onto yourself in a way that is both home movie and also kind of collective document in some way, or can be shared as a public document. But at the same time, like, you know, I was telling this to Maggie earlier, and I really mean it, like, it's also really wild how you make this work and you don't really know where it'll end up and how it'll circulate and who gets to see it and in what conditions. And then suddenly, you know, a couple years go by and you're in a place like this and you're speaking about it to other people who have formal questions, right? And who are engaging with it as artists or as thinkers from other places. And suddenly you're looking at something that you've done in some sort of like intuitive way, you know, just because it feels honest and like pertinent, and there's something at stake there that is important to you. And so I feel like I'm also at the same time, like, you're always in the process of understanding what you've done in some way, I would say. But I think that just, I'll wrap up by reiterating the fact that I do think that the thing that connects like my grandma's film and the police films is this interest in like, what are the images that survive? Especially what are the images that have survived, like the climate and time and, you know, underfunding and et cetera.
I guess simple question, but I guess when, do I press that? When was the film from your grandmother's, I guess that section of it filmed? Because to me, I identify more, I'm not an artist, but as an observer, like I can feel my fingers like going through the, you know, the mantle over the vanity, or the smell of the stuff, or the chancletas, or the playing with the stick on the ground. What years were those filmed?
Well, Celaje has fragments from a lot of different moments. It's kind of wild because it's really a product of the pandemic lockdown in a way, you know, of having time and mental space to kind of revisit a lot, like an accumulation of materials, and to suddenly find ways in which they connect. And it, you know, and so there's a Super 8 film of my grandmother at the World's Fair in New York in '64. That's in like, it's like the most damaged film that looks the oldest. But then the shots of her in her house as an older woman in the beginning of the film, those were shot for my thesis film when I was in film school in like 2008. But I never finished that thesis film, so it was like this unfinished burden that I was carrying for a really long time, wondering if I would ever find a place for it. And I kept filming my grandmother in other ways, in other moments. But it wasn't until 2020 that suddenly I sat down and I had all of these different materials from different periods and different encounters, and some of it was staged and some of it was very like much more like a home movie. And suddenly I had these rolls of film that I had shot in her burial, for example, that I never intended to be publicly shared, but I had filmed them because I had been filming her for so long that I felt like, oh, this is the last time I get to film her, so I might as well bring the camera, you know. And all of a sudden, all of those pieces kind of found a way to connect with each other. But yeah, there's like 64, 2008, 2019, the range.
I figured they were more recent, but the memories I connected with remind me of the 80s. That's what I thought.
Well, her house is like a time capsule of science. Yeah. Anyone else?
Hi, Sophia. So you've already touched on this a bit, but I'm thinking a lot about archives in my own work actually as well, and I just read Ariella Azule's Potential History, and so I'm thinking a lot about kind of the potentialities within archives despite the institutional violence out of which they emerged. And you've talked about this a bit, but if you could just expand a little bit more on this idea of like improvisation and kind of how to work through these contradictions in a way where on one end these police films are representative of state violence, of coloniality, and yet in your hands in this moment there's a way in which it also allows you to maybe not recover, but to think about this idea of how does Puerto Rico remember, right? So I don't know, like that tension I think is really interesting, and there's I think a lot of artists as of late who've been trying to kind of work with that very complicated spot of the archive, and so I would just love to hear more from you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for your question. I think the police films are a really good example of what you're talking about. I mean, Ariella Azule is awesome too, and I've also been reading her. And I think it's tricky because in the case of this collection, I mean, I would start off by saying that I was drawn to it thinking, oh my God, like in the midst of everything that's been lost, here's, you know, the gaze of the police survived, and the police ended up accidentally documenting, you know, their documentation of all of these movements from the 60s and 70s outlived the documentation of a lot of people who were a part of those movements, who were filmmakers or who documented for any number of reasons. And I was really expecting that to be like a gold mine, you know, and I started digitizing the film, and I think part of the lesson was finding that, you know, half of the rolls were either kind of badly shot or damaged in ways that didn't, you know, that just didn't allow them to really function as films or as the documents that I was expecting them to be. But then they were revealing other things. And I think that the process of thinking with those films has been really gratifying, and like in a way of really starting to understand, you know, how what is there for me to do when inserting myself in a space like an archive, I guess, right? And again, how do you push, like, how do you respect the work of the archivist and want to support it in some way that balances out what you're extracting from that space, but at the same time, your responsibilities are not the same? And how do you allow yourself to engage with these materials in other ways? And also consider the ways that they circulate, or also consider, you know, for me, the police films like have been materials to really try a lot of things with so far. For example, I showed them, I projected them for a bunch of filmmakers who are part of some of the movements that are in the films, and who made films at that time as well. And I wanted to get kind of their reactions to the films. And obviously it was like watching a family album, you know, like they were just like remembering people and places and identifying people and complaining about the bad filmmaking. And at the same time, when I asked them about, like, where are your films of these moments and these movements, you know, they had a laundry list of all the ways in which they lost their films, whether it was in hurricanes or divorces or bankruptcies or what, you know, like a range of situations, right? And I think that there's, to me, you know, like, as much as we might know these things in theory, it's also about kind of grounding them in like a concrete, concrete examples, you know, and so to be able to see those rolls of film, even if a lot of the information that I was hoping for is not in them, they reveal other things, you know, or to be able to share them with these filmmakers didn't really produce the conversations that I was looking for, but it grounded my understanding of, you know, where their archives were, for example, you know, how that absence was created that allowed for this to be the surviving document. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's an ongoing, you know, it's like an ongoing quest. And like I said, I truly believe that there's so much work to be done that I'm always excited when there's many people wanting to do it, because I think that it requires a lot of different approaches, and for us to be like looking at each other's work and talking about these things with each other, and engaging with these materials differently. It's, for example, it's for some kind of strange but beautiful reason, this archive from the police department wasn't really on any priority list for the archive in terms of digitizing. But then they were able to get some funding to digitize the sound collection. And there was an artist who worked in that process. Another artist managed to get another grant to digitize a lot of the still images. And I've been digitizing the films. And I think it's interesting that, you know, like, who are the people that take it upon themselves also to participate in the process of historization and of preservation, right? Like this collection, technically, it's in the formal institutional archive, you know, being taken care of by the state through this legal order. But if no one can see them, if they don't circulate, it's almost, you know, it's as good as if they don't exist, you know, which is what happens with a lot of these Puerto Rican collections at Smithsonian. They're just in really nice climate-controlled shelving, you know, but like no one gets to see them or research them, and so I think it's, you know, it's very promising that artists take it upon themselves to insert themselves into these spaces without necessarily a desire to be, you know, to kind of own that material as their own, or like claim any sort of authorship to a particular work based on that, but to really open it up for other people to do things. And so I'm excited that this is happening, at least in Puerto Rico, in relationship to this collection, you know, and like, I think that's full of potential.
Other questions?
It's a beautiful place to end if there aren't any more questions, but I'll walk slowly. If anybody else is holding on to something, thank you so much. Oh, you have
Thank you all so much again. Oh, and the film is playing till when? Till May?
May 19th.
May 19th, yeah. So if you haven't spent time with it, there's some really cozy cushions, or if you want to tell your friends.
Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Sophia. It's fantastic.